is just waiting in silence just a little bit to arrive. And okay. So maybe it's good to tell you a little bit about the why of this interview. I'm interested in creativity. I've been done a little bit of writing on that, and I'm interested in how people get to new ideas, who inspires them, who teaches them, how people's life history kind of creates sometimes a unique situation for a certain discovery, or and also how people work together to build this human building we're making in the last 100 years, I suppose, which is kind of knowledge and science. So that's my interest. Apart from that, of course.
Well, I like that.
Sure.
So when you told me about initially, that sort of element of creativity sort of adds an extra element to it that I like. It makes it,
Yeah, and of course, I'm a psychotherapist, and I'm also very curious about what you do through psychotherapy. So there's like a double interest. It's not only creativity, but it's also like how you do it and how you make it happen. So, I'd like to start off with. I think I heard in the APA video that it was a life before becoming a psychotherapist, that you first went to Zen Center, and that you were reading already Sullivan before you started becoming a psychologist. So my question is really like, what was there before, and when did that decision happen? When you were like, hey, I have to study this. This is my path or something.
It's difficult to remember precisely. I remember when I was in high school, and I've talked about my daughters with this. I thought I was going to be a journalist. I didn't really sort of think a lot about what it would mean to be a psychotherapist or anything of that sort. And so I didn't actually, sort of decide I wanted to become a psychotherapist. Even when I was an undergraduate, I just took some sort of general liberal arts courses. And it was really only after I dropped out of after my first year, maybe it was the middle of my first year of university, I dropped out of school. I was out of school for a year or two, and then when I came back, that I decided I want to be a therapist. Although, to be frank, even in maybe the first year, I was sort of starting to think that. But I think the roots of it go back further. I think when I was younger, when I was 12 years old, my father died. And so that was, just having to deal with that, I think sort of led to my developing a certain kind of sort of precocious maturity, I suppose, and sort of reading, popular psychology things, I suppose. And without going into all the family dynamics,
sure.
I think, as with many therapists, is the way in which I ended up being sort of the therapist to my family. And then I think what happened was that a lot of my peers started, sort of coming to me for advice. So I ended up sort of playing that role with my peers. So, there was something about, having gone through that traumatic experience, plus whoever I was to begin with, and so on, that probably sort of predisposed me towards an interest in the psychological. And then somewhere in university, I started thinking I want to be a therapist. And I didn't really sort of think much further than that as to, what would be the route to be becoming a therapist. Would I write? Would I do research? It was just, I just sort of had this idea that being a therapist was a good thing to do. And I actually remember when I had dropped out of university, at one point I had this old Volkswagen van. It was in the 60s, maybe early 70s. And I drove down with two friends to Mexico through the United States. And on the way, one of my friends, who'd been a friend of mine from high school, I hadn't seen in a couple of years, he picked up this book by, the psychiatrist R.D. Laing. And it wasn't a book by him, it was a book about him. And I'd never heard of him before. And so I started reading the book, and there was something about Laing that really fascinated me. And so I started reading R.D. Laing's book, and to be honest, I think that was a very important influence on me. The such things that he was talking about, his interpersonal perspective, the idea that he's working with these schizophrenics and so on. So in terms of, when you mentioned Sullivan, when I was an undergraduate, one of the first theorists that I started reading was Harry Stack Sullivan. And the way I got to him was somewhat complicated, but without going into all the details, it had something to do with recognizing that Sullivan's thinking had an influence, or in some ways was sort of anticipated some of the things that R.D. Laing was talking about. There was something about looking at things from an interpersonal perspective, which was clearly there in Laing, which always fascinated me. So I started reading books by Sullivan and reading about Sullivan, and he really fascinated me as a character. And his ideas really fascinated me.
Do you think that book really thought, hey, maybe it's a nice idea to become a psychotherapist?
I think the idea of becoming a therapist started developing before then, but there was something about reading Laing and then Sullivan which really sort of consolidated my thinking, not so much about becoming a therapist, but about what interested me intellectually, I suppose.
Yeah.
Is the best way of putting it. Right.
What was fascinating about this interpersonal? I mean, now you've thought about it 30 years, but at that moment, this is maybe a very difficult question, but at that moment, when you read that, what was like the seed or something that you saw, hey, this is it, or this is very good, or this is what I really like?
It's a really good question. There's just something about the sensibility that just sort of captured me as being right. About really sort of viewing everything from the perspective of an interpersonal field. I had a very close friend as well as an undergraduate who became a psychologist.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what is sensibility in the sense of Sullivan?
Well, there were two things that interested me. Number one was this idea that he was communicating with these schizophrenic people who everybody had, sort of thought could not be helped, and that he felt that they actually were saying something meaningful and that one could communicate with them and work with them and help them. But number two, there was something about this idea that you couldn't really understand what was going on unless you understood it in an interpersonal context. And there was something about that, I can't really explain why, but that's sort of a sensibility which has really run throughout my work. If I think of it. So, for example, later on I got involved in sort of focusing on the therapy of alliance and alliance ruptures and when communication breaks down, essentially. And I suppose there was something about the fact that, why was I so interested in what happens when communication breaks down? And I guess it must have been because I was sort of sensitive to that in some way as a child. Like I just had some feeling that, you'll be talking to somebody and everything is fine, and then all of a sudden it's like things start falling apart, and so there's this kind of, the way Sullivan spoke about it, he would say there's anxiety in the room.
So it's like you somehow recognize that, and that made really a lot of sense to you. This
That's right.
Down, this suddenly be without contact, or it stops, or something.
That's right. So that struck me as really important. So, I could elaborate at greater length, but I think that was the beginning of that particular sensibility.
I think we'll come back to that, because actually that's an important issue where I would like to go. But I think what is special in your career is that you have investigated so many different approaches to psychotherapy. It's not like most people who start off with one and then they fall off their belief and they go to another one. But you really went through a lot. You started off with CBT, and then you worked with Greenberg on emotion, and then you turned more into the interpersonal processes in the cognitive therapy, the alliance ruptures. Then you turned to relational psychoanalysis, and finally mindfulness in Buddhism. At least that's in your writing. Now I understand that that's much earlier, but I mean, there's really like all these interests, and now we're going to have this workshop, and suddenly attachment is there as a real issue. So my question is like, why do you think that happened? Meaning that you're so go to all these places. Is it like you're not satisfied with something, or is it more like I'm curious and I want to drink it all in and want to understand it all?
I think more the latter. It's I never I've never been a true believer, and I've never thought that one approach will give the answers. So I've just always followed things where my interests take me, and to be frank, I think all those different themes that you mentioned, most of them were probably there at the beginning at some level. It's not as if I went from cognitive therapy to interpersonal theory to sort of mindfulness or whatever. It's the fact that I became involved in cognitive therapy was somewhat of an accident of history. I went to a graduate school that happened to be cognitive behavioral. It was not really an interest of mine, but that sort of being in that environment led me to sort of work within that environment and try to sort of frame my thinking within that environment. Mm-hmm. So that had an important influence on me. The interpersonal aspect of it was there long before then. There was an existential sensibility long before then. Mm-hmm. The attachment aspect of it, I had studied John Bowlby as an undergraduate. I was kind of interested in him. I thought what he was saying was intriguing. And then subsequently I had some cousins who became very involved in sort of doing research in attachment theory, and they sort of reintroduced me to John Bowlby. Mm-hmm. And so I started reading him more carefully. So, it's like none of these things, it's not as if I went from one thing to another. It's more like a lot of these things were there, and I was always interested in them. You mentioned, sort of emotional Les Greenberg. Now, that in some senses was an accident of history, in the sense that I happened to be at the same university as Les Greenberg. I was a new graduate student. He was a new faculty member. He was a faculty member in a different department. I was in a cognitive behavioral department. I sort of was finding, as I was starting to try to do clinical work, that these people didn't really, it felt like they didn't have a lot of clinical wisdom, really. I took an elective seminar with Les Greenberg. I thought, he seems to really know something about doing clinical work. We started talking, and things really clicked.
So that was a look.
Yeah, so there was just a sense in which things really clicked between us. And we used to have, in terms of creativity, I think that was probably one of the most, if not the most creative collaborations I've ever had. Is the way in which we used to just sort of spend hours talking with one another, and there's a sense in which we would sort of like build on one another's ideas, and it was very exciting. I had another friend who I used to do that with, but we never wrote together. So I think it's those kind of experiences are rare creative collaborations. So I think it was really because Les and I really sort of clicked and shared certain sensibilities, although we were very different in other ways. So that sort of led me in the direction of I wasn't interested in Gestalt therapy beforehand. I sort of had some Gestalt therapy training from Les. I subsequently got it from other people. And then all the work on emotions, etc., etc. It's not that I had an initial interest in emotions. It just sort of emerged out of my collaboration with Les and the fact that I was in this kind of cognitive behavioral sort of box at the time, where emotions were not considered to be a primary phenomenon of interest. That sort of, I think, gave me and him some sort of, sort of something to work with in some sense. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe it's good to, we were talking about this collaboration and collaboration with other people. I mean, they're important works, like I think that are really crucial works, like the interpersonal processes and cognitive therapy book that you wrote with Siegel, and then there's the other book, The Negotiating Therapeutic Alliance, you wrote with Maren. So it seems like you're always working with someone. Is that a correct assumption?
That's true for most of the books that I've written, but not for all of them.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, collaboration is important to me. There's something about, and some collaborations have sort of fed me more, and they all feed me in different ways. Some collaborations have sort of, to be honest, there's a way in which any collaboration I've been in one way or another has been nourishing for me, but in different ways. And sometimes it has to do with, sort of being stimulated by the fact that, sort of we build upon one another's ideas. In other cases, with Zinzel Siegel, for example, it's like we were very close. We worked together. We had lunch together every day, but we used to sort of debate every day. We would always be sort of on opposite sides of the argument, and we used to love that. So that used to be kind of exciting to both of us. It was kind of fun. We used to laugh together hysterically. With Chris Moran, it's the collaboration is a different collaboration. I think that's more one in which, sort of gradually over time, we've sort of like built upon things together, and we provide support of different kinds to one another. Each collaboration is different, but collaborations have been important to me.
Yeah. I see. Going back to all these different areas that you have studied over the years, there's so many therapists who turn away from psychoanalysis. To me, it seems that you came back to psychoanalysis somehow, or ended up in psychoanalysis. Maybe that's a wrong assumption, but at least in the articles you publish in and the titles of your articles, it seems that you have really embraced at least relational psychoanalysis lately. So that's interesting. Maybe you could comment on that. For so many people, it's like they turn their backs to psychoanalysis, and you're kind of finding it back.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I sort of, when I was an undergraduate, I grew up in Canada where there wasn't much alive psychoanalysis, and the psychoanalysis I read and was exposed to in the 60s was sort of, that was like in the heyday of American ego psychology, and it had become a certain sort of orthodoxy, and there's a certain kind of esoteric jargon to it, and all sorts of trappings of psychoanalysis, which subsequently have become the object of critique, such as the insularity and the elitism and so on and so forth. And so, I was critical of that aspect of psychoanalysis, and really didn't understand the language of psychoanalysis, wasn't influenced by it. There weren't any psychoanalysts. But for all that, I was very fascinated by the history of psychoanalysis. I used to spend hours in the library reading about the sort of like early meetings between Freud and his followers and the Wednesday evening meetings.
Now
and so
you
on.
make a video for APA, which is, if I'm not wrong, called Psychoanalytic Therapy. So you're really, you advocate yourself as psychoanalytic therapist, at least.
Right. So that part, essentially what happened was, psychoanalysis was never a perspective that I rejected. Obviously, my interest in interpersonal theory, and even some of my, back in that era when I did my initial interpersonal work, I was influenced by the writing of Merton Gill, who was sort of a well-known contemporary psychoanalyst at the time. So I was influenced by psychoanalytic thinking, but it never occurred to me to embrace sort of the psychoanalytic school. What happened in a nutshell is that I moved to New York from Canada. New York was a very psychoanalytic world. All of a sudden, I was teaching in a university, which was very psychoanalytic. All the audiences I spoke to were psychoanalytic, and all of a sudden, it was a different culture. On top of that, when Jay Greenberg and Stephen Mitchell published their book in 1983, Object Relations and Psychoanalysis, I just happened to pick it up on the bookshelf. I was living in Toronto at the time. I picked it up, I read it, and I thought, now for the first time I really have some understanding of what psychoanalysis is all about. And the sensibility that they were moving towards was very consistent with the interpersonal sensibility which I already had. So essentially what was happening was that at least the relational aspect of psychoanalysis was moving towards a sensibility which was more consistent with the way in which
And you found
saw
material
things
there which was really useful for you to bring into what you were doing.
Exactly. And so, without going into all the details, for sort of a number of years, I would sort of incorporate certain ideas from contemporary relational theorists. I would read, the journals and so on and so forth, and then ultimately I went into formal psychoanalytic training in New York.
Okay, so what if you, after all this, and I know that sometimes you even write in your articles that you don't even try to change, or that change is even a difficult concept in a certain way, at least from the Buddhist perspective. What kind of change are you looking for in clients? Or are you looking for change? It's a big question.
Yeah.
But make it simple. Like, what comes to mind? Like, so what kind of a change do you like to see to happen to your? What makes you happy when you see?
Yeah, my sense is that to some extent the kinds of changes that I see depend upon the state of mind that I'm in and the people that I'm working with. I'm probably not somebody who's ever sort of, some therapists, for example, in this, strategic therapy movement at a certain point of family systems movement, or maybe the early cognitive behavioral movement would talk about these dramatic changes that can take place quickly. That my life has not been one of making dramatic changes personally. Any changes that I've made in my life have been subtle.
What do you think is the most important change that you made in your life, even subtle?
I think just sort of a growing acceptance of things the way they are, in some sense,
Not trying to change.
Perhaps. Did I ever struggle to change? Maybe there's a time when I had more of a desperate sense of not being happy the way I was and having some fantasy that one day I'd be different. Mm-hmm. And so I probably think that over time I've had sort of a growing acceptance of my own, sort of vulnerabilities and humanity, I guess is what it comes to. And with that has become a little bit more patience for myself and patience with other people.
I really resonate with that when you say this, because this is one of the things that I noticed when I liked this video with the woman, the relational video we've made with APA, where with the woman whose father has shot her husband.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so she has this interpersonal style, and of course you can see that this somehow can create problems to her, but there's also this, it's more than acceptance, it's really like you really admire her, how she find her way out and her way to survive with this terrible drama that happens to her. I guess it touches somehow on Buddhism, but I mean, I find that really beautiful, this very deep, not only acceptance, really admiration of human condition. Can you...
Yeah, I mean, that sort of feels like almost, I don't know if it's a different dimension, maybe it's a related dimension, but probably there is some sense in which I've developed a greater ability to appreciate, people for who they are, and in their sort of uniqueness, and also, I guess I do see, sometimes I'm just really sort of blown away by the sort of strengths that people show, in a way, or just sort of like the struggles that they've been through, etc. So I think probably in that case, it's not so much. I think the sort of acceptance has less to do for me with, like, it's not so much that I, for example, admire myself more. If anything, I probably admire myself a lot less than I do when I was younger. It's just the way in which I'm just. I'm not going to say I'm, happy with who I am, but I'm just sort of somewhat more accepting, with myself than I was when I was younger. And I think that's probably true. There's a way in which, I see that people, get very, very stuck, and that's incredibly hard to change. And I think there probably was a time when that would be a source of, I think when I first started seeing that when I was doing therapy when I was younger, I thought, oh my God, it's like I'm a failure. And gradually over time, I began to sort of have a sense of, well, sometimes people seem to change, or they make some very quick changes, etc., but it's sort of not as simple as that. And I just began to develop the sense that, look, sometimes people can be very, very stuck, and the changes they make, may be remarkably subtle over a long period of time. Like, there's somebody who I'm working with now where at some point I remember saying to him, and this is not a phrase that I use all the time with patients, but I just said something like, look, if you can maybe change, 2% or 3%, that's enough. And he actually, what was interesting to me was that, sometime later on, he hung on to that, and that was significant for him. But I think it's not just that I used those words. I think that was sort of like my using those words in that context with him was a way of sort of capturing a certain sensibility I had in the relationship with him that I wanted to convey to him, right? And that was meaningful to him, right? And I could see that, and I think that's been meaningful to me. I think I've always struggled, in a sense, with the question of, what is change and how much do people really change? And I've asked various people the same question. People who I admired, people who I thought were, wonderful therapists. There was this Gestalt therapist who I worked with for a number of years, who I learned a tremendous amount from. His name was Harvey Friedman. I hope he's still alive. And I remember at one point asking him, because he used to talk a lot about the experiences he had working with Fritz Perls and how he changed. And so I asked him, because he sometimes made it sound like change was very dramatic for him. And I asked him, well, so what is what does change mean? He says, look, he says, you can do things heavy or you can do things light. And that just sort of struck me in some way. I'll give you another example. I had a teacher for many years who was a Tibetan Lama, who was in his 60s at the time. And I used to ask him a lot of questions about, because the students used to say he was, quotes, enlightened, whatever that meant. And I would say, so what does it mean to be enlightened? You know, people say you're enlightened, you're enlightened. He said, I don't know. And he said, look, and his English was not very good, but he was speaking broken English, and say, look, he said, I have emotions. I think he used to sort of like tease me because, you know, I was a psychologist and he heard I wrote about emotions, or, you know, he'd say, I have emotions, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm this, I'm that, you know. He said, but, you know, I have all the concerns that anybody else concerns. It's just that my concerns, the phrase he used was, just don't have the same kind of root that they used to have. Whatever that, I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but it was just some other captured the same sensibility. And he was I was struck by the fact that he was very much of a vulnerable human being with a lot of flaws, who was still revered by his students because of his kindness and his humanity and his compassion. There was something special about him, you know? So I think I've always struggled with that question of what is change and how much can you change? And I think that's, in some sense...
And that there's really a limit to change, maybe. You know, it's not like we're going to be super happy persons.
At least that's the way I see the world. You know, people see the world differently. You know, for some people... I remember at one point I started this project with some students where we were interviewing some people about changes they'd had, you know, and we interviewed some people who said, you know, who talked about amazing dramatic changes they'd had. Or I know there's this book out that some people put out a number of years ago called Quantum Change. I can't remember who wrote it, but, you know, they were psychologists who, you know, sort of interviewed various people who talked about having profound experiences. And clearly people do have profound experiences, you know, where, you know, the difference seems like the difference between night and day.
Did you ever have that?
No. That has not been my experience.
Okay.
But people do have those experiences, I believe it.
Sure. I would like sidestep a little bit because this is related in a sense. You as a therapist quite easily admit helplessness and impotence in moments of being stuck and don't know how to help, really. And actually through your influence I started doing that as well, and it's really a liberating experience for a therapist. But I also wonder, how do you think that is important for a client, for a patient, to know or to see their therapist admit that, you know, they're helpless or they feel impotent at a certain point?
Yeah. I think there's something, I mean, you know, maybe at some point in my life I sort of thought about how that might be useful for a client. And I suppose, but it feels a bit far away because it's just become such a natural part of who I am. But I suppose there is some level that if I think about experiences that have been very important to me, it's when you see somebody, I think there's this complex dynamic, okay, where if you go to see a therapist, you're automatically in the role of sort of being the sort of like dependent person who's looking, towards. I mean, in psychoanalytic terms, it's a transference, right? So, you know, inevitably, you even if you're not aware of it, you know, and even if you sort of like you feel critical of the person, there's still some way that the role confers a certain authority and power.
And as you
the person
admit these moments, it's kind of demystified.
Well, it's not just that it demystifies, you know. If you're with somebody and it's somebody who, is working with some integrity and who really wants to help you, and you sort of feel has some degree of wisdom and has lived life.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that, there's a way in which they, to some extent, can accept the fact that they're human beings.
Mm-hmm.
That helps you get a sense, it helps me get a sense of that's all there is. There's just being a human being. It's like you don't become a Superman or a Superwoman. It's like everybody has this transformative fantasy, that, one day, I'll be psychologically healthy. One day I'll become enlightened. One day I'll be... And I think to the extent that you sort of like start to see that that's not what it's all about, I think that's very freeing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Next thing I would like to go to is, as I read back through your books, I recognize a certain style in your videos, in your vignettes, and of course there are many different interventions, but some are very typically and really uniquely for me. Oh, that's safran, and I don't see that very much in other therapists. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So see if you can recognize it, and we can understand a little bit better what that is. So, for instance, in the interpersonal process book, you say, "You're too fast for me. It keeps me off balance in a way." Or, "When you say that, I start doubting my sanity."
I said that?
Yeah. Exactly like that. That was basically what you said. Yes. In the negotiation book, so you say, "So the ball is in my field now," or something like that.
My card in English.
I feel nailed to the wall, or I feel stuck right now and I can't find the right thing to say. In the interpersonal APA video, you say, "It feels very nice to be cared for by you, but it also creates a sort of pressure or stress in the relationship." And in the 6 video series, you say, "I feel put on the spot. I feel I have to cut the slack," I think is the expression. "I feel at a loss." And in the rupture video, you say, "I feel that there's nothing that I can say that will be helpful to you." And in another point, you say, "I feel pushed away or feel hit over the head."
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you hear these, my selection, let's say, what comes to mind? What kind of interventions are these?
Well, it's interesting because some of the things that you're reciting I actually don't remember saying, although I believe you.
Uh-huh.
But some of them sound more familiar, and I think that one of the issues is that sort of over time, especially like as I'm writing or teaching or whatever, sort of like I'll end up giving examples to people, so I'll use the same example more than once, right? But there's a way in which once I've said the same thing more than once, it's not real anymore. Is a thing, mm-hmm. right? So any one of those things, hopefully, if it sort of felt right at the time, mm-hmm. it sort of captured some sense, some implicit sense I had, intuitive sense I had of something that was going on at the time in the relationship that wasn't articulated, and I was also trying to capture it in a way which sort of wasn't blaming the other person, but rather was sort of mm-hmm. acknowledging, sort of my dilemma in some way. And, sometimes when I've said things of that sort, there is, it does end up being blaming. It's not just, over time I've come to feel, at one point I used to think, well, you have to find a way of saying things that aren't blaming. it's not so, I don't feel that way anymore. It's more like when there's an impasse or when I'm feeling stuck and I start trying to talk to somebody about what's happening, there's a way in which at the beginning I'm still stuck, I'm still embedded, I'm still, sort of participating unconsciously in what's going on. So often, the first time I try to say something, even though I think, if you think of it, it's like if you're having a fight with your wife, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It's like anything you say, or anybody you're close to, it's just like you think it's a way of getting out of the argument, but it's just another move in the same game, you see. And so I think that's the sort of realization which has become very important to me, that like I think I'm doing something different, right? So when I'm saying these things to patients, I think I'm doing different. Sometimes I am, but sometimes it's just another move in the same game, right? And it's just sort of like gradually over time, as I sort of like gauge the response and think about what I'm doing, etc., that things shift inside of me. And when things shift inside of me, I'm able to see things in a new way. And when I see things in a new way, then I'm able to communicate about what's going on in a way which is stepping outside of the dance. And when I'm able to do that, that's not blaming them, that's not blaming me.
Yeah. When I was, of course there's the issue of form, of how you say it, and if it's blaming, if you feel it is critical and all that, and if you can really take distance. But when I read all those things, not all of them, but many of them, I thought, in a way, it seems like you're communicating to the person how you are uncomfortable with them. Like how people push and pull and control, or give you the control, or manipulate you subtly, or distance themselves, or come too close. And it's like you're... I was trying to understand how you do it, or what this is, and it somehow struck me that it seems like you're communicating subtle discomfort that you feel in the interaction. Does that make any sense?
It does, and clearly when I talk about what's going on in that way or meta-communicate, I am responding to a feeling of being stuck or uncomfortable, okay? But I think there was a time when I used to think that what was important is that I'm sort of communicating the impact they're having upon me, hopefully in a non-critical way. The shift has been that I don't think that's what's most important anymore. I think what's most important is for me to begin a process of talking about things which will ultimately help me move into a different state of mind so I can see things differently. And when I see things differently, then I'm no longer feeling blaming of the other person, or I'm no longer feeling it's like it's either their fault or my fault.
So it's something you do together.
Yeah, when I can genuinely see that, I could give various examples, but when I can sort of like genuinely see things in a new way, then the words come out in a way which is helpful.
But there is a kind of uncomfort before you start saying and expressing, trying to express. It's like a marker.
I begin to get a sense is that something is stuck or not quite right, or
You know what I really, whenever you make these interventions, that they're really like, wow, yes, that's exactly it. I think that you're really very good at capturing and putting that into words, and it's, as you say, it's really like not any word, it's like the word for that situation. It's very specific and new and fresh, and that's exactly what's happening. So much, even that you had these videos, which are the rupture videos, I think, that were done with actors, and they somehow don't really fit. That's my sense, because it's not really that person. So, and I wonder, this sensibility you have to to notice what's going on for little discomfort, or that it's not entirely straight, sort of, like Kaiser says. I mean, did you always have this, or is this? I mean, I guess it improved, but I mean, it's there from the beginning, that you.
The sensibility that something is a little bit off was always there. I think gradually over time I began to sort of develop more of a sense of the value of articulating and putting it into words. But I think the important distinction that I want to make, and this boils back to, or this harkens back to a conversation you and I were having just before we started this interview, is that as I see it, what I'm doing is not like a form of character analysis in the Reichian sense. Maybe at the beginning it was influenced by that. It was influenced by my reading of Wilhelm Reich. It was influenced by training as a Gestalt therapist, etc., etc. There's some sense in which, like, if I could sort of like comment on the person's, what they're doing, what their character is, etc., that might be helpful. I think that the shift has been to sort of a realization that for me, the most important aspect is not helping the person see what they're doing. I mean, they may ultimately come to see what they're doing, but the important shift is for me to be able to step outside of the enactment, shift the way I'm feeling, and when I'm able to do that, I'm able to see things from a new perspective, and that helps the person begin to shift the way they see things. And so it's like working from the inside out rather than the outside in.
You're really in the dance with the person.
In some ways, yes, yeah.
Some ways?
Well, I mean, rather, yes. I don't want to elaborate in great detail. Yes,
Okay.
yes. Definitely in the dance with the person, yes. Unequivocally.
This notion of dance.
Yeah.
It's how do you listen for it? I mean, this touches a little bit on mindfulness, but it's like you listen for something. It's not you're not going to listen to the noise of the. Street or something.
There's a certain, I could answer that at different levels. Sort of one level, in some ways, the easiest level is that, if I begin to feel that something feels a little uncomfortable, or, sort of, if I notice that there's some shift in terms of my feeling of relatedness to the person, or I start to notice some shift in my emotion, then I start to try to understand what's going on. So that's one level. But the other thing is, I think over time what's happened is I've begun to sort of feel that it's almost like sort of every person, there's a certain, it's like a certain kind of music to who they are. Mm-hmm. And there's a certain kind of music to being in a relationship with them. And so there's something about just sort of like feeling your way into that music and who you are in a relationship with that person
and you do want
and
to
that
communicate
music.
That. And you do want to communicate that.
Yeah. And there's something about that it sort of gives me a sense, sort of like an intuitive sense of like, what's the essence of that person, at least to me? And obviously the essence of that person is influenced by who I, my take on it is influenced by me. But it's a way of like feeling myself into the music of that person, and who they are with me at least.
And do you feel that all the time? Or is that something...
Outside of therapy, you mean?
Yes.
Probably less aware of it outside of therapy. There's something,
Are you aware of it now?
No, I'm not really. Let me put it this way: if I felt uncomfortable with what was happening now, right now, for example, I'm aware of the fact that we have somebody watching us who's probably feeling a little bit impatient right now, so I'm aware of that. Okay. Yeah, certainly at some level, I sort of like watch you to get a sense of, how you're responding to what I'm saying. Okay, but by and large, I'm sort of enjoying this conversation, the opportunity to sort of like articulate, what I feel and think. But there's a way in which, unless I'm called upon by the situation, there's something about when I'm there as a therapist, and I'll say this to people, there's something about the circumscribed situation in which I'm not there primarily to take care of, I don't have to, obviously my needs are important, but basically I have a job. Mm-hmm. My job is to be as helpful as I can to the patient. Okay? Now, I have to take my needs into account. To the extent that I don't, then I'm not going to be helpful to the patient. But there's something about the sort of the well-defined focus of it that helps me focus and be more aware of things than I am in everyday life. So it's almost like an altered state of consciousness. If I could be like that all the time, that would be great, but I can't.
Mm-hmm. Is that where mindfulness comes in for you?
Well, there's a way in which I think there's something about doing therapy. Doing therapy is one big mindfulness practice. It's not like you have to do mindfulness practice to be a therapist. It's like doing therapy for me. It's the same thing as doing sort of like a sitting meditation. It's like an ongoing mindfulness practice. That's what it is. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it heightens your awareness. It's an altered state of consciousness, and that's actually that's one of the best things about it.
What's beauty in therapy for you?
That. I knew you were going to ask me that question. I had other answers ready for you.
Well, give me a few.
Well,
but this is
that's incredibly important. I hadn't really sort of thought about it. It's just like the heightened state of awareness I can develop when I'm doing therapy. Sort of related to that is sort of like some sense of.
How does it make you feel good?
There's just a sense in which all of my senses are alert. It makes me aware of, helps me become aware of what's most important in life to me. It makes me think about my life, and what's been important in my life. It makes me, when I'm working with people, I think about what I'm struggling with, what I have struggled with. It's like, sometimes there's like an incredible relationship between doing therapy and how I'm feeling in my everyday life. It's sometimes if I'm stuck in my everyday life, doing therapy with the patient helps unstick me. Sometimes it's the other way around.
People pay you.
And people pay me. Can you believe it? Yeah. But there is something about it. As a therapist, it can be hard work. It can be painful. It can be hurtful. People say all sorts of horrible things to you. You have failures. It can be boring, etc., etc. There's also a way in which, at its best, it helps me live life in a way that feels right to me. Not just while I'm doing therapy, but it can sort of have an impact on my life outside of therapy.
Yeah. What was the other beauty? Or is that irrelevant next to this?
I can't even remember anymore what I was going to say. To be frank, sort of the answer that I was going to come up with don't feel as real to me as this right now.
Yeah. It is beautiful, really. Makes me jealous.
No, it really can be. Not always, obviously. I don't want to, sort of, I really, that's the other thing. It's like, I don't want to, sort of glamorize or idealize, my experience as a therapist. It's like, and this is important, I think. It's like, I think this is a way in which, I feel that, there's a way in which when I'm working with people, I sort of struggle between moments when I sort of like have some sense of faith that it's worthwhile and that it's valuable and I can help them, and some sense of despair, about, my ability to help them. But again, that coincides with my own life. There's some sense of, if I'm feeling despairing about therapy, then I'm feeling despairing about life, or if I'm feeling despairing about life, then I'm feeling despairing about therapy. So it's that kind of, struggle between faith and despair.
We have to end, I guess, but my last question would be, could you just, when you were exactly going this direction of my question, it's like, I mean, how does that work? I mean, you're with a patient and the patient's struggling and you're remembering all these things of your own life as well. Isn't it confusing? I mean, how... Can you tell a little bit more about that? How does
it's not confusing. No. I mean, there's time to do all of that. I mean, it's... at least I find, it's not as if, I sort of start thinking of my own life and then I get distracted, etc. Or if I do, it's not a big deal. It's just, look, our minds are complicated. A lot of things go on at once, if you attend to them, So somebody will be talking about something and all of a sudden I'll remember something that happened to me, when I was 15 years old, or, I'll be thinking about something in the future. And, at the same time, listen to the person and there's just resonances,
Resonant and resonating.
Yeah, so that it all just kind of comes together, I feel. And so there's room for it all. And it is that, I think it is those sort of resonances between the patient's life and my own life experiences and my thoughts about my patient, my thoughts about my life and life in general that create a whole for me.
Oh, it came out really clear. Fantastic. Feels somehow that I'm so distant from that.
Really? Well, I'm often distant from it myself. It's just, it's like, look, you're interviewing me right now. Mm-hmm. Sort of rising to the moment of the interview helps me get in touch with what I feel passionate about, right? Do I always feel like that in my life? No. Do I always feel like that when I'm doing therapy? No. Mm-hmm. But right now, in the context of this discussion, this interview, it's sort of, I start to feel passionate. It's great.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I always feel that way.
Something like therapy at its best for you, like, when it really works out.
Yeah, it's like life at its best. It's like relationships at their best. Moments at their best.
I think this was a wonderful moment. Thank you.
Thank you.